The day Margaret Hollingsworth arrived in Oroville, California, was the day that would forever change her life and the life of one Will Reed, though neither of them could have possibly known it at the time. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Oroville Hotel, kicking up a cloud of dust that momentarily obscured the late afternoon sun of that hot summer day in 1876. Margaret stepped down from the stagecoach, her face flushed from the heat and the long journey from Boston. At 22 years old, she was striking despite her travel-worn appearance, tall for a woman, with gentle curves hidden beneath her traveling dress, which was now wrinkled and stained with the dust of the journey. Her honey-brown hair was pinned up neatly beneath her hat, though several strands had escaped and now framed her face, which was pink from the heat. "Miss Goodwin," the driver called down from his perch, "your trunks will be unloaded shortly." Margaret nodded her thanks, though her attention had already been captured by the bustling main street of Oroville. She had expected a dusty, lawless town, like the ones she'd read about in those penny dreadfuls her father had forbidden her to read. Instead, Oroville was a proper town, with boardwalks lining the street and various establishments, a general store, a saloon, and what appeared to be a millinery shop among them. The discovery was both a relief and a disappointment. First time in Oroville, miss. The hotel manager had emerged from the building and now stood beside her, hands clasped behind his back. "Yes," Margaret replied. "I've come to stay with my aunt, Beatrice Goodwin. She owns a bakery, I believe." The manager's face lit up with recognition. "Oh, Miss Beatrice. Of course, her shop is just down the street. Finest pies in all of California, if you ask me. She'll be pleased to see you, I reckon." Margaret thanked him and gathered her skirts, preparing to make her way to her aunt's bakery, when the sound of hoofbeats caught her attention. A group of cowboys was riding into town, their horses kicking up dust as they approached the saloon across the street. Margaret found herself watching them, particularly the one in the lead, a tall man with broad shoulders, his face shadowed by his hat. "Those would be the boys from the Double R Ranch," the hotel manager explained, following her gaze. "They come into town every couple of weeks. The one in front is William Reed. He runs the place since his pa passed last year." As if sensing their scrutiny, the cowboy in question, William Reed, looked up just then, and for a brief moment his eyes met Margaret's across the dusty street. Something fluttered in her chest, and she quickly averted her gaze, embarrassed at being caught staring. "I should find my aunt," she said, more to herself than to the manager, and started down the boardwalk, all too aware of the feeling of eyes following her as she went. Will Reed had indeed noticed the young woman standing in front of the hotel. It wasn't often that new faces appeared in Oroville, particularly not faces as pretty as hers. But he had business to attend to, and so he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post outside the saloon, pushing thoughts of the stranger from his mind. "Will, you coming?" called his friend and foreman, Thomas Jenkins. "Be right there," Will replied, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. At 28, Will Reed was in his prime, tall and muscular from years of hard work, with a handsome face bronzed by the sun. The women of Oroville often commented that it was a shame such a fine specimen remained unmarried, but Will had little time for courting. Running the ranch his father had built from nothing took most of his time and energy. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of whiskey. Will made his way to the bar, where he ordered a drink and listened to the conversations around him. The topic du jour, it seemed, was the arrival of Beatrice Goodwin's niece from back east. "Heard she's come to help with the bakery," said one man. "Old Beatrice's hands ain't what they used to be." "Well, I for one am looking forward to seeing a new face around here," said another. "Especially one as pretty as they say she is." Will found himself curiously interested in this gossip, thinking back to the woman he'd seen outside the hotel. That must have been her Beatrice Goodwin's niece. He made a mental note to stop by the bakery the next morning, perhaps under the guise of ordering a pie for Sunday dinner. Meanwhile, Margaret had found her way to Goodwin's Bakery, a small but welcoming establishment with a cheerful sign hanging above the door. The bell tinkled as she entered, and the scent of fresh bread and sweet pastries enveloped her. "Be with you in a moment," called a voice from the back room. Margaret waited, taking in the cozy shop with its display case of baked goods and small tables where customers could enjoy their purchases. A moment later, a woman emerged from the back, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She was in her 50s, plump and rosy-cheeked, with gray-streaked hair pinned up in a practical bun. "Aunt Beatrice," Margaret ventured. The woman looked up and her face broke into a wide smile. "Margaret. Is that really you? My, how you've grown." She hurried around the counter and embraced her niece. "Let me look at you." She held Margaret at arm's length, studying her face. "You have your mother's eyes, God rest her soul. How was your journey? You must be exhausted." Come, let me close up shop and we'll get you settled." As Beatrice bustled about, locking the door and putting away the day's remaining baked goods, Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been anxious about this move, about leaving behind everything she knew in Boston to come to this wild place. But her aunt's warm welcome and the unexpected charm of Oroville were reassuring. "I've prepared the room upstairs for you," Beatrice said as she led Margaret through the back of the shop and up a narrow staircase. "It's not grand, but it's comfortable. We live above the shop, convenient for early morning baking." The apartment was indeed modest: a small parlor, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom with an actual porcelain tub, which Margaret was thrilled to see after her long, dusty journey. "Now you rest," Beatrice insisted, showing Margaret to her room. "Tomorrow I'll introduce you to everyone. The folks here are good people, you'll see." That night, as Margaret lay in her new bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the western night, the distant piano music from the saloon, the occasional shout or burst of laughter, she thought about the cowboy she had seen. William Reed. There had been something in his eyes, even in that brief moment when their gazes met, that had stirred something within her. It was ridiculous, of course. She had come to Oroville to make a fresh start, to help her aunt with the bakery, not to moon over handsome cowboys like a schoolgirl. With that firm resolution, she closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, unaware that across town, in the room he kept at the boarding house for nights when he stayed in town, Will Reed was thinking of her as well. Morning came early at Goodwin's bakery. Margaret was roused from sleep by the sound of her aunt moving about the kitchen, preparing dough for the day's bread. Hastily dressing in a simple brown skirt and white blouse, she made her way downstairs to help. "Good morning," Beatrice greeted her with a smile. "I was going to let you sleep in after your journey, but since you're up, would you like to learn how to make my famous sourdough?" Margaret eagerly agreed, and soon she was up to her elbows in flour, kneading dough as her aunt explained the process. It was hard work, but satisfying, and by the time they opened the shop at 7, Margaret felt a sense of accomplishment at the sight of the freshly baked loaves cooling on the racks. "You're a natural," Beatrice commented approvingly. "Your mother always said you had a talent in the kitchen." The mention of her mother brought a pang to Margaret's heart. It had been 2 years since the consumption had taken both her parents within months of each other, leaving Margaret alone in the world except for her aunt in far-off California. The family home and her father's law practice had been sold to pay off debts, leaving Margaret with little choice but to accept her aunt's invitation to come west. The bell above the door tinkled, announcing the first customer of the day. Margaret looked up and her heart skipped a beat. It was William Reed, his tall frame filling the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Morning, Miss Beatrice," he said, his voice deep and pleasant. "Thought I'd stop by for some of your apple pie. Got company coming for Sunday dinner tomorrow." "Will Reed, just the man I wanted to see," Beatrice said cheerfully. "Come meet my niece, Margaret. She's just arrived from Boston and will be helping me with the bakery from now on. Margaret, this is Will Reed. He owns the Double R Ranch just outside town." Will turned his gaze to Margaret, and she felt a warmth spread through her at the recognition in his eyes. "Miss Goodwin," he said, inclining his head, "I believe I saw you arriving yesterday. Welcome to Oroville." "Thank you, Mr. Reed," Margaret replied, conscious of the flour that dusted her apron and probably her cheeks as well. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "The pleasure's all mine," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. Beatrice, seemingly oblivious to the current passing between them, bustled over to the display case. Now, about that apple pie, I've got one fresh from the oven, or I can make you a special one for tomorrow if you'd prefer. Will tore his gaze away from Margaret to address her aunt. Fresh would be fine, Miss Beatrice, I appreciate it. As Beatrice wrapped the pie, Will turned back to Margaret. So, what do you think of our little town so far, Miss Goodwin? It's different from Boston, Margaret admitted. But in a good way, I think. Everyone seems very friendly. We're a close community here, Will said with a nod. Folks look out for each other. Your aunt is one of our most respected citizens, you know. Her bakery is the heart of Oroville. Beatrice laughed as she handed him the wrapped pie. Oh, stop with your flattery, Will read. Here's your pie. That'll be 35 cents. Will paid for the pie, tipping his hat to the ladies. Miss Beatrice, Miss Goodwin, hope to see you both at church tomorrow. After he left, Beatrice gave Margaret a knowing look. Well, that's interesting. What is? Margaret asked, pretending ignorance. Will Reed has been coming to my bakery for years, but I can't recall him ever making small talk like that before. He's usually all business in and out with a polite word or two. Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm again. I'm sure he was just being welcoming to a newcomer. Beatrice said, but she didn't press the issue, instead turning to serve the next customer who had just entered. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity as Margaret helped her aunt serve customers and learned the routines of the bakery. By closing time, she was exhausted but pleased with herself. She had managed to remember most of the regular customers' names and preferences, and Beatrice had praised her quick learning. You're going to fit right in here, her aunt told her as they cleaned up the shop. The customers already like you. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself thinking once more about William Reed. There was something compelling about him, beyond his obvious good looks. He had a quiet confidence, a steadiness that she found appealing after the chaos of the past 2 years. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. Margaret dressed in her best dress, a pale blue affair with lace at the collar and cuffs, and accompanied her aunt to the small church on the edge of town. The building was packed with nearly every resident of Oroville, it seemed, and as they took their seats, Margaret felt many curious gazes upon her. Midway through the service, she became aware of someone watching her more intently than the others. Glancing across the aisle, she saw Will Reed, his eyes meeting hers briefly before he looked away. He was seated with a group of men who Margaret assumed were his ranch hands, all of them cleaned up and in their Sunday best, though they still stood out among the townspeople with their weathered faces and calloused hands. After the service, Beatrice introduced Margaret to what felt like the entire population of Oroville. There was Sheriff Daniels and his wife, the schoolteacher Miss Perkins, Doctor, and Mrs. Hamilton, and countless others whose names blurred together in Margaret's mind. Everyone was polite, if a bit curious about the Boston girl who had come to live in their midst. Miss Goodwin, a now familiar voice said, and Margaret turned to find Will Reed standing behind her. I was wondering if you and your aunt might like a ride back to town in my wagon. It's a hot day for walking. Before Margaret could respond, Beatrice answered for both of them. That would be lovely, Will, thank you. And so Margaret found herself seated beside Will on the bench of his wagon with Beatrice on her other side as they made their way back to town. The proximity to him made her acutely aware of his presence, the clean, soapy smell of him mixed with something essentially male, the breadth of his shoulders beneath his Sunday suit, the way his hands handled the reins with confident ease. How are you finding the bakery work, Miss Goodwin? He asked, glancing at her. It's harder than I expected, she admitted with a small laugh, but satisfying. I enjoy creating something with my hands, Will nodded. I understand that feeling. There's nothing quite like seeing the results of your labor, whether it's a herd of healthy cattle or a field of good crops. Or a perfectly baked loaf of bread, Beatrice added. They arrived at the bakery all too soon for Margaret's liking. Will hopped down from the wagon and offered his hand to help first Beatrice, then Margaret, down from the bench. His hand was warm and strong around hers, and she felt that same flutter in her chest as when their eyes had first met. Thank you for the ride, Mr. Reed, she said. Will, he corrected with a smile, Everyone calls me Will. Then thank you, Will, she said, returning his smile. He tipped his hat to them both and climbed back onto the wagon. Enjoy your Sunday, ladies. As Margaret and Beatrice watched him drive away, Beatrice nudged her niece gently. I do believe Will Reed has taken a shine to you, Margaret. Don't be silly, Aunt Beatrice, Margaret protested, though she couldn't help the pleased feeling that spread through her at the thought. He's just being neighborly, Beatrice chuckled. I've known that boy since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, and I've never seen him just being neighborly to a pretty girl before. He's always been too busy with that ranch of his. Margaret didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply followed her aunt inside, trying not to dwell on the implications of Beatrice's words. The weeks that followed fell into a pleasant routine. Margaret rose early each morning to help her aunt prepare the day's baked goods, and by the time they opened the shop at 7, the delicious smells of fresh bread, pies, and pastries filled the air. The mornings were busy with customers, but the afternoons were quieter, giving Margaret time to explore Oroville and become acquainted with its residents. To her delight, Will Reed became something of a regular at the bakery, stopping by every few days, ostensibly to purchase bread or pastries, but lingering to chat with Margaret whenever possible. She learned that he had been born and raised on the Double R Ranch, that his father had died the previous year, leaving Will to run the large cattle operation on his own. He spoke of his work with passion, his eyes lighting up when he described the open range and the satisfaction of a successful cattle drive. In turn, Margaret told him about her life in Boston, her parents' deaths, and her decision to come west for a fresh start. She found him easy to talk to, a good listener who never made her feel that her urban upbringing was something to be ashamed of in this frontier town. One afternoon, about a month after Margaret's arrival in Oroville, Will came into the bakery just as she was preparing to close for the day. Beatrice had gone to visit a friend who was ill, leaving Margaret to mind the shop alone. Afternoon, Margaret, Will said, removing his hat as he entered. The gesture and his use of her first name, which had gradually replaced the more formal Miss Goodwin, sent a pleasant shiver through her. Hello, Will, she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. What can I get for you today, actually? He said, looking a bit nervous. I was wondering if you might like to go for a ride tomorrow afternoon. It's your day off, isn't it? I thought I could show you some of the countryside around Oroville. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. This was more than the casual conversations they'd been having. This was an actual invitation, a proper outing together. I'd like that very much, she said, hoping her voice didn't betray her excitement. Will's face broke into a grin that transformed his already handsome features. Wonderful. I'll come by around 1 if that suits you. 1 o'clock would be perfect, Margaret agreed. After he left, she found herself humming as she finished closing the shop, her mind already on what she would wear the next day and what it would be like to spend an afternoon in Will's company, away from the bakery and the curious eyes of Oroville's residents. When Beatrice returned, Margaret told her about Will's invitation. Well, it's about time, her aunt said with satisfaction. I was beginning to think he'd never work up the courage to ask you properly. The next afternoon, Margaret was ready and waiting when Will arrived. She had chosen to wear her riding habit, a dark green affair that had been one of the few quality garments she'd been able to bring with her from Boston. Her hair was pinned up beneath a small hat, and she carried a parasol to protect her fair skin from the California sun. Will arrived on horseback, leading a gentle-looking mare for Margaret. This is Daisy, he said, patting the horse's neck. She's as sweet-tempered as they come, should be easy for you to handle. She's beautiful, Margaret said, approaching the mare and offering her hand for the horse to sniff. Hello, Daisy. Will helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist as he lifted her into the side saddle. Once she was settled, he swung up onto his own mount, a magnificent black stallion. That's Midnight, he told her, seeing her admiring glance. He's been with me for 5 years now. Best cow horse I've ever had. They set off at a leisurely pace, heading out of town and into the countryside. The late summer landscape was golden, the hills rolling gently in the distance. Will pointed out landmarks along the way: the creek where the town got its water, the old Miller place where the first settlers had built, the distant mountains where gold had been discovered years before. "It's beautiful," Margaret said sincerely. "Different from New England, but beautiful in its own way." "I've never been east of the Mississippi myself," Will admitted. "Always meant to travel someday, but there was always too much work to do on the ranch." "Perhaps someday," Margaret suggested. Will nodded, though he didn't seem convinced. "Maybe, though I can't imagine anywhere more beautiful than this." He led her to a high point overlooking a valley where cattle grazed peacefully. In the distance, Margaret could see a large house and several outbuildings, the Double R Ranch, she presumed. "That's home," Will confirmed, following her gaze. "My father built that house when he married my mother, added onto it over the years as the ranch grew. It's a good, solid place." There was pride in his voice and something else, a hint of loneliness, perhaps. Margaret wondered what it was like for him, living in that big house alone, managing the vast ranch and its employees. "It looks wonderful," she said. "You must be very proud of what your family has built." "I am," he agreed, "though sometimes it feels like a big responsibility for one man." They dismounted and sat on a fallen log, looking out over the valley as Will told her stories of growing up on the ranch, learning to ride almost before he could walk, helping his father with the cattle drives, the hard winters and the good years that had shaped his life. Margaret found herself captivated not just by the tales themselves, but by the man telling them. There was a depth to Will Reed, a thoughtfulness that belied his cowboy exterior. He was educated, she discovered, having spent a few years at a school in San Francisco before returning to the ranch. He read voraciously, everything from Shakespeare to the latest scientific journals, ordering books from as far away as New York and even London. "My mother insisted on it," he explained when Margaret expressed surprise at his literary knowledge. "Said just because we lived on the frontier didn't mean we had to be ignorant. She was a schoolteacher before she married my father." As the afternoon wore on, they fell into a comfortable conversation, sharing their thoughts on books they had both read, discussing the differences between Eastern and Western lifestyles, and gradually revealing more of themselves to each other. "I never thought I'd end up in a place like Oroville," Margaret confessed. "After my parents died and I had to sell our home, I felt so lost. Coming here was a last resort, really, but now I'm starting to think it might have been the best thing that could have happened to me." Will's eyes were warm as he looked at her. "I'm glad you came, Margaret. Oroville is better for having you in it." The sincerity in his voice made her heart race, and for a moment she thought he might lean in to kiss her. But instead, he stood and offered his hand to help her up. "We should head back. The sun will be setting soon, and your aunt will worry." The ride back to town was quieter, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the bakery, Will helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for this afternoon," Margaret said. "I enjoyed it very much." "So did I," Will replied. "Perhaps we could do it again sometime." "I'd like that," she said with a smile. He tipped his hat to her and rode off, leading Daisy behind him. Margaret watched him go, a strange mixture of happiness and longing filling her heart. It had been a perfect afternoon, one she would treasure in her memory. But there was also a new awareness between them now, an unspoken acknowledgement that what they felt for each other was more than friendship. As the weeks passed, Will and Margaret spent more time together. He would often invite her for rides on her days off, sometimes bringing a picnic lunch prepared by the cook at the ranch. They explored the countryside around Oroville, visited the nearby mining town of Forbestown, and once even ventured as far as Bidwell's Bar to see the suspension bridge that was considered a marvel of engineering. During these outings, they grew closer, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams and disappointments. Margaret told Will about her sheltered upbringing in Boston, the expectations that she would make a good marriage to a professional man, and how her parents' deaths had changed everything. Will spoke of the pressure he felt to live up to his father's legacy, his concerns about the changing cattle industry, and his dreams for the Double R Ranch. "I want to expand," he told her during one of their picnics. "Not just cattle, but horses too." There's good money in breeding quality horses, and the land to the north of the ranch would be perfect for it. But it's owned by Harlan Tucker, and he won't sell to me." "Why not?" Margaret asked, curious. Will's expression darkened. "Old grudge." "My father and Tucker had a disagreement years ago over water rights. Tucker's held a grudge ever since, even though the courts ruled in my father's favor. Says he'll sell to anyone but a Reed." Margaret could see how much this bothered him, and she reached out to touch his hand. "Perhaps he'll change his mind eventually." Will gave her a grateful smile, turning his hand to clasp hers. "Perhaps. In the meantime, I'm making do with what I have. The ranch is profitable, and we're doing well." It was the first time he had held her hand, and the simple contact sent a thrill through Margaret. They sat there for a moment, hands entwined, before Will reluctantly released her to pack up their picnic things. As fall arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of winter to come, Margaret found herself thoroughly integrated into Oroville life. She knew all the regulars at the bakery by name, had joined the Ladies' Aid Society that met at the church, and had even been invited to dinners at several of the town's more prominent homes. But it was her growing relationship with Will that brought her the most joy. They weren't officially courting, no formal declaration had been made, but everyone in town seemed to know that Will Reed and Margaret Goodwin had an understanding between them. Beatrice certainly thought so, often making comments about what a handsome couple they made and how the Double R Ranch could use a woman's touch. "Aunt Beatrice, please," Margaret would protest, embarrassed. "Will and I are just friends." But they both knew it was more than that, even if neither of them had put it into words yet. There was a tenderness in the way Will looked at her, a gentleness in his touch when he helped her onto her horse or handed her down from his wagon. And Margaret found herself thinking of him constantly, wondering what he was doing when they were apart, looking forward to their next meeting with an anticipation that went beyond mere friendship. It was late October when things changed between them. Will had invited Margaret to dinner at the Double R Ranch the first time she would see his home up close. Beatrice had given her blessing, along with a knowing smile that made Margaret blush. "Just be back at a reasonable hour," her aunt had said, "and remember you're a lady, Aunt Beatrice." Margaret had exclaimed, scandalized, "It's just dinner." But as Will's wagon approached the impressive two-story house she had only seen from a distance before, Margaret felt a flutter of nervous excitement. This felt significant, being invited to Will's home, meeting his staff, seeing where he lived his private life. The house was even more impressive up close, a solid structure built of local timber, with a wide porch wrapping around the front and one side. Flower beds, now mostly dormant with the approach of winter, lined the walkway to the front door. "It's not much compared to the houses in Boston, I'm sure," Will said as he helped her down from the wagon, "but it's home." "It's wonderful," Margaret assured him. "So much character." Inside, the house was comfortable and well-appointed, with solid furniture, colorful rugs, and walls adorned with paintings and photographs. A woman in her 60s, introduced as Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper, greeted them warmly. She had been with the Reed family since Will was a boy, he explained, and had taken over running the household after his mother's death from fever 10 years earlier. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Miss Goodwin," Mrs. Peterson said, her eyes twinkling. "Will has spoken of little else but you for weeks now." "Mrs. Peterson," Will protested, his cheeks reddening. The housekeeper merely smiled and excused herself to finish preparing dinner, leaving Will and Margaret in the parlor. Will showed her around the room, pointing out items of interest: a portrait of his parents on their wedding day, a rifle that had belonged to his grandfather, a collection of books that had been his mother's. "She would have liked you," he said softly, running a finger along the spine of a volume of poetry. "My mother, she was a great reader like you." "I wish I could have met her," Margaret replied. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Will agreed. "Strong like you." "She had to be out here." He cleared his throat, seemingly embarrassed by his own candor. "Let me show you the rest of the house before dinner." He led her through the dining room with its long table, for when all the hands eat inside during bad weather. He explained, and into a study that had clearly been his father's domain, with a large desk and walls lined with ledgers and agricultural journals. Upstairs, he showed her the library, a sunny room filled with books and comfortable chairs. "This was my mother's favorite room," he told her. "She spent hours in here reading or writing letters. After she died, my father couldn't bear to change anything about it." Margaret could feel the history in the house, the lives that had been lived within its walls. It wasn't just a home, it was a legacy, one that Will was now carrying forward alone. The thought made her heart ache for him. Dinner was served in the smaller breakfast room rather than the formal dining room, creating a more intimate atmosphere. Mrs. Peterson had prepared a delicious meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh vegetables from the ranch's garden, followed by an apple pie that Will insisted wasn't as good as those from Goodwin's bakery, making both women laugh. After dinner, they returned to the parlor, where a fire had been lit to ward off the evening chill. Mrs. Peterson brought them coffee, then tactfully retired for the night, leaving them alone. "Thank you for coming tonight," Will said as they sat before the fire. "I've wanted to show you my home for some time now." "Thank you for inviting me," Margaret replied. "It's a beautiful home, Will. You should be proud." "I am," he said, "but lately I've been thinking it's too big for just one person." He set his coffee cup down and turned to face her fully. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." Her heart began to race at the serious tone in his voice. "What is it?" "These past few months, getting to know you, spending time with you, they've been the happiest of my life." He took a deep breath. "I never thought I'd meet someone like you, especially not here in Oroville. You're smart and kind and beautiful, and I've fallen in love with you, Margaret." Though she had hoped, had even suspected that his feelings matched her own, hearing the words spoken aloud made Margaret's breath catch. "Will, I know it might be too soon," he hurried on. "I know you came here for a fresh start, not necessarily to find this. And I know I'm just a rancher, not the sort of educated, cultured man you probably expected to marry back in Boston, but I love you and I wanted you to know." Margaret reached out and took his hand in hers. "Will Reed, do you really think I care about any of that? These past months have been the happiest of my life, too. Getting to know you has been a gift I never expected when I came to Oroville." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "I've fallen in love with you, too." The joy that spread across his face was beautiful to behold. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Margaret Goodwin, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Will." He leaned forward then and kissed her, a gentle, sweet kiss that held the promise of their future together. When they parted, his eyes were filled with such tenderness that Margaret felt tears spring to her own. "I don't have a ring yet," he apologized. "This wasn't exactly planned. But I'll get one as soon as possible." "I don't need a ring," she assured him, "just you." They spent the next hour making plans, talking about when they would marry. They agreed on the spring, when the weather would be better and the most pressing work of the ranch would be done, and how they would tell everyone. Will insisted on speaking to Beatrice formally, asking for her blessing as Margaret's only living relative. "Though I think she already knows how I feel about you," he added with a smile. "I think the whole town knows," Margaret laughed. Mrs. Peterson certainly wasn't surprised. It was late when Will finally drove Margaret back to town, both of them reluctant to end the evening but knowing it was proper to do so. He helped her down from the wagon in front of the bakery and kissed her once more, a lingering kiss that left her breathless. "Good night, my love," he whispered. "I'll come by tomorrow to speak with your aunt." "Good night, Will," she replied, her heart so full of happiness she thought it might burst. "I love you." She watched him drive away, then entered the bakery where Beatrice was waiting up despite the late hour. One look at Margaret's radiant face told her aunt everything she needed to know. "Well," Beatrice said, beaming, "I see you had a good evening." The news of Will and Margaret's engagement spread quickly through Oroville. Most people expressed delight, saying they had seen it coming for months and that they made a perfect match. A few of the town's young ladies were disappointed, as Will had been considered one of Oroville's most eligible bachelors, but even they had to admit that Will and Margaret seemed truly in love. The winter months passed in a blur of happiness for Margaret. She continued to work at the bakery while also beginning to prepare for her new life as Mrs. Reed. Will took her to the ranch frequently, showing her the operations and introducing her to the hands who worked for him. They were a rough but good-natured bunch who clearly respected their boss and seemed to approve of his choice of bride. Never seen the boss so happy, one of them, an older man named Charlie who had worked for Will's father before him, told Margaret one day. "You're good for him, miss, real good." Margaret also began to learn about running a ranch household from Mrs. Peterson, who was delighted to share her knowledge. "Been waiting for years for Will to find himself a wife," she confided in Margaret. "The house needs a woman's touch and he needs someone to care for him. He works too hard and thinks too much on his own." As their wedding approached, scheduled for the first Saturday in April, preparations intensified. Margaret ordered fabric from San Francisco for her wedding dress, which Beatrice and several of the town's women helped her sew. Will, meanwhile, was making improvements to the house, adding a new bathroom and enlarging the master bedroom to better accommodate a married couple. "I want everything to be perfect for you," he told Margaret during one of their rides. "I want you to be comfortable and happy in your new home." "I'll be happy because I'll be with you," she assured him, "but I do appreciate the new bathroom." He laughed and leaned over to kiss her, something he did frequently now that their engagement was official. Margaret never tired of his kisses, of the feeling of his strong arms around her, of the love she saw in his eyes when he looked at her. March brought warmer weather and the first signs of spring to Oroville. Margaret's wedding dress was finished a beautiful creation of ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, more elegant than anything she could have purchased ready-made in the small town. Beatrice had insisted on providing a proper trousseau for her niece, ordering linens and nightgowns from San Francisco. "You'll be the most beautiful bride Oroville has ever seen," Beatrice declared as Margaret tried on the dress for a final fitting. "Will Reed won't know what hit him." Margaret blushed at her aunt's words. The approaching wedding brought with it certain expectations and responsibilities that both excited and intimidated her. While her mother had given her a vague understanding of what happened between a husband and wife, there were many things she was uncertain about. She found herself both looking forward to and apprehensive about her wedding night. A week before the wedding, disaster struck. A severe storm hit the area, causing the Feather River to overflow its banks. Much of Oroville was flooded, including Goodwin's bakery. Margaret and Beatrice worked alongside other townspeople to save what they could, but much of their equipment and supplies were damaged. "The ovens are ruined," Beatrice said, surveying the damage once the water had receded. "And most of the flour is soaked through. It'll take weeks to get the place operational again, and that's assuming the structure is sound." Will arrived at the bakery, having ridden into town as soon as he heard about the flooding. He found Margaret and Beatrice amid the sodden remains of their livelihood, both women exhausted and dispirited. "Are you both all right?" he asked, gathering Margaret into his arms. "When I heard about the flood—" "We're fine," Margaret assured him, drawing comfort from his embrace. "Just tired and wet, but the bakery." Will looked around at the damage, his expression grave. "It's bad but not unfixable. We'll help you rebuild better than before." Beatrice asked. "The town," Will said firmly. "Everyone loves your bakery, Miss Beatrice. No one wants to see it close. And I've already spoken to some of the men. We'll organize a work party to start repairs as soon as possible." True to his word, Will mobilized not only his own ranch hands but also many of Oroville's other residents. Within days, the bakery was cleaned out, the damaged equipment removed, and repairs to the structure begun. Margaret was touched by the community's response, by how quickly people had rallied to help. "This is what makes Oroville special," Will told her as they watched a group of men installing a new floor in the bakery. "When someone's in trouble, everyone pitches in." But despite the progress, it was clear that the bakery wouldn't be operational in time for the wedding. Beatrice was concerned about the financial impact of being closed for weeks, possibly months. "I don't have the resources to replace everything," she admitted to Margaret one evening. "The ovens alone will cost more than I have saved." "We'll find a way," Margaret assured her, though she wasn't sure how. Her own savings were minimal, having been mostly depleted by her journey west and the few personal items she had needed since arriving in Oroville. The next day, Will arrived at the apartment above the bakery with a proposal. "I've been thinking," he said to both women. "The wedding is in less than a week, and afterwards Margaret will be moving to the ranch. Miss Beatrice, why don't you come too? You can stay with us while the bakery is being repaired." Beatrice shook her head. "I couldn't impose on you like that, Will. It's not an imposition," he insisted. "The house is plenty big enough, and it would give you time to figure out what to do about the bakery without worrying about where to stay or how to eat." Margaret looked at her aunt pleadingly. "Please consider it, Aunt Beatrice. I'd feel better knowing you were taken care of while I'm getting settled at the ranch." After some consideration, Beatrice agreed, though she insisted it would only be for a short time. "Just until I can get back on my feet." With that settled, preparations for the wedding continued. Despite the flood and the damage to the bakery, the entire town seemed determined that the Reed-Goodwin wedding would proceed as planned. The church, fortunately, had been spared the worst of the flooding, and the ladies of the congregation worked tirelessly to ensure it was decorated beautifully for the ceremony. The day before the wedding, as Margaret was doing a final check of her packed trunks, most of which had already been sent to the ranch, Beatrice came to her room with a small wooden box. "I've been saving this for you," she said, setting the box on the bed beside Margaret. "It was your mother's. She gave it to me for safekeeping before she died, asking me to give it to you on your wedding day, but I think she'd want you to have it now." Curious, Margaret opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. Opening it, she found a miniature portrait of her parents on their wedding day. "Oh, Aunt Beatrice," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "It's beautiful. Your mother wanted you to have something of her on your wedding day," Beatrice said, her own eyes moist. "She would be so proud of you, Margaret, so proud of the woman you've become and the life you're building here." Margaret hugged her aunt tightly, grateful beyond words for her presence and support. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. "For giving me a home when I needed one and for helping me find Will." "You found him all on your own," Beatrice replied with a smile. "I just provided the setting." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and mild, a perfect spring day. Margaret woke early, too excited to sleep, and spent the morning with Beatrice and several of the town's women who had come to help her prepare. Her hair was arranged in an elegant style, adorned with small white flowers, and she wore the locket her aunt had given her beneath her wedding dress. "You look absolutely beautiful," Beatrice declared when Margaret was finally ready, the ivory silk of her dress catching the light as she moved. "Like an angel." The church was filled to capacity when Margaret arrived on the arm of Sheriff Daniels, who had offered to give her away in the absence of her father. As the organ began to play and the congregation rose to its feet, Margaret took a deep breath and began her walk down the aisle. Will was waiting at the altar, tall and handsome in his best suit, his eyes fixed on her with an expression of such love and wonder that it nearly took her breath away. When she reached him and Sheriff Daniels placed her hand in his, Will squeezed it gently, his silent reassurance calming her nerves. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, with traditional vows spoken in clear, steady voices. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Will kissed her with a tenderness that made several of the women in the congregation sigh audibly. The celebration afterward was held at the town hall, which had been decorated with spring flowers and ribbons. There was music and dancing, food prepared by many of the town's women, and a beautiful cake that had been made by a bakery in Marysville as a gift to Beatrice, whose own bakery was still unable to produce such items. As they danced together for the first time as husband and wife, Will held Margaret close, murmuring in her ear, "Happy, Mrs. Reed, incredibly happy, Mr. Reed," she replied, smiling up at him. "Though I'm not sure I'll ever get used to being called Mrs. Reed." "You have a lifetime to practice," he told her, kissing her forehead gently. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Will and Margaret slipped away to begin the journey to the ranch. Beatrice would follow the next day, giving the newlyweds a night alone together to begin their married life. The ride to the ranch was quiet, both of them content in each other's company, occasionally exchanging glances full of love and anticipation. When they arrived, the house was lit up warmly, Mrs. Peterson having prepared everything for their arrival before tactfully leaving for the night to stay with her sister in town. Will carried Margaret over the threshold, making her laugh at the traditional gesture. Inside, the house was spotless, with flowers in vases and a cold supper laid out in the dining room should they be hungry. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed," Will said, setting her down gently in the entrance hall. "It's perfect," Margaret replied, looking around at what was now her home. "Everything is perfect." Will showed her the improvements he had made for her: the new bathroom with its modern fixtures, the enlarged bedroom with a beautiful new bed, the dressing room he had created for her use. Everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of his thoughtfulness, his desire to make her comfortable and happy in her new home. Finally, they retired to their bedroom, where Margaret felt a sudden attack of nerves. Despite her love for Will, the intimacy of marriage was still unknown territory for her. Sensing her apprehension, Will was gentle and patient, giving her time to prepare for bed in privacy while he did the same. When she emerged from the dressing room in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, Will was waiting for her, dressed in his own nightclothes. He held out his hands to her and she went to him, trusting in his love. "I love you, Margaret," he said softly. "More than I ever thought possible. We have all the time in the world. There's no rush for anything." His consideration eased her fears, and as he kissed her, she felt herself responding naturally to his touch. That night they became truly husband and wife, their love expressed in the most intimate way possible. Will was tender and considerate, making the experience beautiful rather than frightening. Afterward, she lay in his arms, marveling at the depth of connection she felt to him. "I never knew it could be like this," she whispered. Will kissed her forehead, holding her close. "For me either," he admitted. "With you, everything is new and wonderful." In the days that followed, Margaret settled into her role as mistress of the Double R Ranch. Beatrice arrived as planned, taking one of the guest rooms and quickly establishing a friendly relationship with Mrs. Peterson. The two older women often sat together in the evenings, sharing stories and giving Margaret advice about running a household. Margaret found she enjoyed ranch life more than she had expected. She learned to ride astride rather than side saddle, much to the amusement of the ranch hands, and took an interest in the breeding of horses that Will had mentioned wanting to expand into. She even learned the basics of cattle ranching, accompanying Will on his rounds when the weather was good. "You're a natural," he told her proudly after she successfully helped to round up some strays. "A real ranchwoman." "I don't know about that," she laughed, pushing her hair out of her face, "but I'm learning." As spring turned to summer, the bakery in town was gradually restored. New ovens were installed, the floors and walls repaired, and fresh supplies ordered. The cost was significant, but Will had surprised Beatrice by offering to invest in the business. "I've always thought Goodwin's Bakery could be even more successful with a bit of expansion," he told her. "Perhaps adding a proper tea room where ladies could gather in the afternoons." "What do you think?" Beatrice was hesitant at first, not wanting to accept what she saw as charity. But Will was persuasive, pointing out the business potential and assuring her that he expected a return on his investment. Eventually, she agreed, and plans were made to reopen the bakery in late summer with the new additions. Life at the ranch fell into a pleasant rhythm. Will and Margaret breakfasted together early each morning before he went out to work. Margaret would then spend her mornings managing the household, often consulting with Mrs. Peterson about meals and other domestic matters. In the afternoons, she might ride out to see Will if he wasn't too far afield, or work in the garden that she was establishing behind the house, or read in the library. The evenings were her favorite time. Will would return, clean up, and they would have dinner together, sometimes with Beatrice joining them, sometimes just the two of them. After dinner, they would sit in the parlor, talking about their day, making plans for the future, or simply enjoying each other's company. And then there were the nights when they retired to their bedroom and found joy in each other's arms. "I never thought I could be this happy," Margaret told Will one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "When my parents died, I thought that was the end of everything. But it was just the beginning of a new chapter." Will squeezed her hand. "For me too, running this place alone after my father died. It was lonely. Empty. You filled it with life again, Margaret." In August, a letter arrived from Mr. Harlan Tucker, the neighbor who owned the land Will wanted to buy for his horse breeding operation. Tucker was finally willing to sell, he wrote, not to Will directly, but to Margaret, if she was interested in purchasing it in her own name. "That old fox," Will said, shaking his head after reading the letter. "He's still holding onto his grudge against my father, but he's found a way around it. What do you think, Margaret? Do you want to become a landowner in your own right?" Margaret considered the opportunity. She had been thinking about her role on the ranch, wanting to contribute more than just running the household. The horse breeding operation that Will had spoken of interested her greatly, and she had been reading books on the subject. "I think I do," she said finally. "If you're willing to teach me the business side of things." Will's face lit up. "I'd be more than willing. You've got a good head for figures, and you've already shown an interest in the horses. We could build something together, something that would be ours, not just inherited from my father." And so it was arranged. Margaret used some of the money from the sale of her parents' house in Boston, which she had been saving, to purchase the Tucker land. Will helped her draw up plans for the horse breeding operation, and by fall, construction had begun on new stables and a training arena. Beatrice, meanwhile, had reopened the bakery with its new tea room, which quickly became popular with the ladies of Oroville. She divided her time between the ranch and town, eventually deciding to live permanently in the apartment above the bakery once more, though she visited the ranch frequently. "This place needs a young family, not an old woman taking up space," she told Margaret when she announced her decision. "And I miss being in town, hearing all the news." Margaret was sad to see her aunt leave, but understood her desire for independence. And truth be told, she and Will enjoyed having the house to themselves again, being able to express their love without worrying about being overheard. As winter approached again, bringing with it the first anniversary of Margaret's arrival in Oroville, she had news of her own to share with Will. She had suspected for several weeks, but a visit from Dr. Hamilton had confirmed it. She was expecting a child in the late spring. She chose to tell Will on a snowy evening in December as they sat before the fire in the parlor after dinner. The house was decorated for Christmas, with pine boughs and red ribbons adorning the mantel and a small tree in the corner that they had cut themselves from the ranch's land. "Will," she said, taking his hand, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her with curiosity. "What is it, love?" "We're going to have a baby," she said, watching his face carefully. "In May or June, Dr. Hamilton thinks." Will's expression transformed from surprise to pure joy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." "Oh, Margaret, that's wonderful news. You're happy then?" she asked, though his reaction had made it obvious. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he said, pulling back to look at her, his eyes shining. "I love you so much, Margaret, and I already love this child we've created together." He placed a gentle hand on her stomach, still flat beneath her dress, but containing the new life they had made. Margaret covered his hand with her own, feeling a sense of completeness that she had never known before. The news of the baby spread quickly, with Beatrice being the first to know after Will. She was ecstatic at the prospect of becoming a great aunt and immediately began planning what she would bake for the christening. Mrs. Peterson took it upon herself to prepare the nursery, bringing down the cradle that had been Will's as a baby from the attic and instructing the ranch hands to repaint it. As Margaret's body changed with the growing child, she found herself thinking often of her mother, wishing she could share this experience with her. The locket containing her parents' pictures became even more precious, a way to include them in this new chapter of her life. Will was attentive and protective, often to the point of hovering. He worried about her riding, about her working too hard, about anything that might pose the slightest risk to her or the baby. Margaret found his concern both touching and occasionally frustrating. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she reminded him after he insisted on carrying her up the stairs for the third time in one day. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, but none of them have been my wife carrying my child, he replied, kissing her forehead. Let me take care of you, Margaret, please. She couldn't argue with the love in his eyes, so she allowed his attentions, secretly enjoying being pampered even as she insisted she was perfectly capable. As winter melted into spring and Margaret's body grew rounder with their child, the horse breeding operation she had established on the Tucker land began to take shape. The stables were completed, and Will had purchased several quality mares to begin their breeding stock. They had also acquired a magnificent stallion from a renowned breeder in Kentucky, paying a small fortune for the animal, but knowing he would be worth it in the long run. Reed and Goodwin horse breeders, Will said, showing Margaret the sign he had commissioned for the entrance to their new venture. What do you think? You used my maiden name, she observed, touched by the gesture. It's your operation as much as mine, he said with a shrug. More really, since you bought the land and had the vision for it. I thought it was fitting. Margaret kissed him for that, grateful for his recognition of her contribution. Many husbands would have simply absorbed their wives' endeavors into their own, taking credit for the ideas and the work. But Will had always treated her as an equal partner, valuing her intelligence and her efforts. In late May, as the California summer began to assert itself with warm days and mild nights, Margaret went into labor. It was a long and difficult ordeal, lasting through the night and into the next day. Will paced the hallway outside their bedroom, driven to distraction by his wife's cries of pain and his inability to help her. Beatrice and Mrs. Peterson attended Margaret, along with Dr. Hamilton, who had been summoned from town. They kept Will informed of her progress, assuring him that everything was proceeding normally, if slowly. First babies often take their time, Dr. Hamilton told him during one of his brief exits from the bedroom. Your wife is strong and healthy. Try not to worry too much. But Will couldn't help worrying. Margaret was his whole world now, she and the child she was bringing into the world. The thought of losing either of them was unbearable. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, a new cry was heard, the lusty wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Will froze in his pacing, his heart pounding as he waited for news. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Dr. Hamilton emerged, smiling broadly. Congratulations, Mr. Reed. You have a healthy son, and your wife is doing just fine, tired but well. Relief and joy flooded through Will in equal measure. A son, he repeated, hardly able to believe it. And Margaret is really all right, see for yourself, the doctor said, gesturing for him to enter the room. Inside, Margaret was propped up on pillows, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion but radiant with happiness. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. Will approached the bed cautiously, almost reverently. Meet your son, Margaret said softly, turning the bundle so Will could see the tiny face within. David William Reed. Will sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. He's perfect, he whispered, just like his mother. Would you like to hold him? Margaret asked. Will nodded, and she carefully transferred the baby to his arms. Will looked down at his son, marveling at the tiny features, the little hands with their perfect fingernails, the wisp of dark hair that promised to be like his own. Hello, David, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm your papa. The baby opened his eyes briefly, revealing a deep blue that would likely change as he grew older, then closed them again, content in his father's arms. Will felt a love so profound it almost hurt, a fierce protectiveness that he knew would last for the rest of his life. Looking up at Margaret, he saw the same love reflected in her eyes. Thank you, he said simply. For him, for everything, thank you, she replied, reaching out to touch his arm. For giving me this life, this family. The next few weeks were a blur of adjustment as they adapted to life with a newborn. David proved to be a good baby, sleeping well and crying only when hungry or uncomfortable. Margaret recovered quickly from the birth, though she was tired from the frequent nighttime feedings. Will was a devoted father, often taking the baby from Margaret so she could rest, walking with him around the house or sitting in the rocking chair in the nursery, telling his son stories about the ranch and the legacy that would one day be his. Beatrice visited frequently, bringing gifts for the baby and helping Margaret when she could. The ranch hands, some of whom had known Will since he was a boy, came by to see the newest Reed, offering congratulations and handmade toys carved from wood or fashioned from leather. Summer passed in a haze of baby care and ranch work. Will continued to manage the cattle operation while also helping Margaret with the horse breeding venture when she was able to spare time from the baby. They hired a young woman from town, Sarah Miller, to help with David and the household, giving Margaret more freedom to pursue her interests. By fall, David was sitting up on his own, growing and thriving in the loving environment of the Reed household. Margaret had fully recovered from childbirth and was once again actively involved in the horse breeding operation, often carrying David with her in a sling as she went about her business. "He's going to be a horseman from the cradle," Will observed with pride, watching as David reached out a chubby hand toward one of the gentle mares. "Just like his father," Margaret agreed, "though I hope he'll also have a love of books like his mother." "With you reading to him every night, how could he not?" Will said, putting an arm around her shoulders. "He'll be the best of both of us, Margaret." As David's first Christmas approached, Margaret found herself reflecting on the incredible journey of the past 2 years. From the desolation of losing her parents and her home in Boston to finding a new life, love, and family in this western town she had never heard of before her aunt's invitation. It seemed almost like a dream sometimes, too perfect to be real. Yet it was real, the solid presence of Will beside her each night, the weight of David in her arms, the ranch that was now truly her home in every sense. She had found her place in the world, a place where she was valued for who she was, not just for what was expected of her as a woman. On Christmas morning, after they had exchanged gifts and watched David play with the colorful blocks Will had carved for him, Margaret had one last surprise for her husband. She handed him a small package, wrapped in simple brown paper tied with a red ribbon. "What's this?" Will asked, curious. "Open it and see," Margaret replied, smiling as she held David on her lap. Will unwrapped the package to find a small wooden frame containing a charcoal sketch of a house not their current home, but a different design with a wide porch and large windows set among trees. "It's beautiful," he said, looking at the drawing. "Did you do this?" Margaret nodded. "It's a design for a new house, one that would be truly ours, not just your parents'. I thought we could build it on the hill overlooking both the original ranch and the horse breeding land. A place that represents our partnership, our future." Will studied the drawing more closely, noting the details. She had included a swing on the porch, a large library, rooms for more children. He looked up at her, his eyes shining. "You're thinking of more children." "Eventually," she said, smiling. "David should have siblings, don't you think?" Will set the drawing aside carefully and moved to join her and David on the sofa, pulling them both into his embrace. "I think that sounds perfect. All of it, the house, more children, our future together. Perfect." "I'm so glad I came to Oroville," Margaret said, leaning against him. "So glad I found you." "No," Will corrected gently. "We found each other." Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the ranch with a soft white blanket that gleamed in the winter sunlight. Inside, the Reed family, Will, Margaret, and little David, remained in their embrace, content in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, with the love that had brought them together and the strength they had found in each other. 2 years later, on a warm summer evening, Will and Margaret stood on the porch of their new house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. David, now 3 years old, played at their feet with his baby sister, Elizabeth Beatrice Reed, who at 6 months was just beginning to crawl. The house was everything Margaret had envisioned, spacious but warm, with the large library she had wanted for the children and plenty of room for the family to grow. It stood on the hill as she had planned, overlooking both the original ranch and the now thriving horse breeding operation. Reed and Goodwin horse breeders had become known throughout California and beyond for the quality of their stock. Margaret had proven to have an excellent eye for horseflesh and a knack for the business side of the operation. Will had expanded the cattle ranch as well, incorporating new breeding techniques and modern management practices. "Are you happy?" Will asked, his arm around Margaret's waist as they watched their children play. "Completely," she replied without hesitation. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible," he said, leaning down to kiss her. "You know, when you first came to Oroville, I thought you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, but I never dreamed you'd look twice at a rough cowboy like me." Margaret laughed, remembering their early encounters. "And I never thought I'd find love in a dusty western town. Funny how life works out," Will nodded, his expression growing more serious. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you, something that's bothered me since the day we met." "What's that?" Margaret asked, curious. "That first day at the bakery when your aunt introduced us, you seemed, I don't know, nervous maybe, like you were afraid of something. What was it?" Margaret was silent for a moment, remembering that day, the flutter of attraction she had felt upon meeting Will and the immediate fear that had followed it. "It's silly," she said finally, "but all my life people had made comments about my size. I was always taller than other girls, more substantial. In Boston, it was considered a flaw. I'd been told more than once that I was too big, too heavy to ever catch a suitable husband. When I saw you, I thought you were the most handsome man I'd ever seen, and I immediately assumed you'd think the same thing about me, that I was too heavy, too much." Will looked genuinely shocked. "Too heavy, you? Margaret, you're perfect, you always have been." "I know that now," she said, squeezing his hand. "You showed me that with your words and your actions, but back then I still carried those insecurities with me." Will pulled her closer, his expression tender. "Well, I'm glad I could help you see yourself the way I see you. Strong, beautiful, perfect." David chose that moment to approach them, tugging on his father's pants leg. "Papa up," he demanded, holding out his arms. Will complied, lifting the boy into his arms. "What is it, son?" "Story," David said firmly. "About the horses, again," Will laughed. "I think you've heard that one 100 times." "Again," David insisted, his expression so like his father's that Margaret had to smile. "Why don't we all go inside?" she suggested, bending to pick up Elizabeth, who had crawled over to join them. "I'll make some hot chocolate, and Papa can tell the story of how we started the horse farm." Will nodded his agreement, and the family went inside the house they had built together, the home that was the physical manifestation of the love and partnership they had found in each other. Later that night, after the children were asleep and they were preparing for bed themselves, Margaret caught Will looking at her with that same expression of wonder he often wore when he thought she wasn't aware. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he replied. "About how different my life would be if you hadn't come to Oroville. Empty, lonely." "Mine too," she said softly. Will crossed the room to her then, taking her in his arms. "I've been thinking about what you told me earlier about feeling too heavy. I hate that anyone ever made you feel that way." Margaret shrugged slightly. It was a different world in Boston, different expectations. "Well, I'm glad you left those expectations behind," Will said firmly, "because the woman you are, strong, capable, perfect exactly as you are, is the woman I fell in love with. The woman I fall in love with again every day. And the man you are, kind, hardworking, loving, is the man I fall in love with every day," Margaret replied, reaching up to touch his face. "I remember once thinking that coming west was my last resort, my only option. Now I know it was the best thing that ever happened to me." Will kissed her then, a kiss full of love and promise, the same promise that had been in his eyes when he had first told her she was perfect. And as Margaret returned his kiss, she thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, from a lonely young woman grieving her parents in Boston, to a confident wife, mother, and businesswoman in Oroville. It had been a journey of discovery, of learning to see herself through Will's eyes, of finding strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I love you, William Reed," she whispered against his lips, "now and always." "And I love you, Margaret Reed," he replied, lifting her easily into his arms and carrying her to their bed. "Now and forever." Outside, the stars shone brightly over the Reed Ranch, over the home and the life that Will and Margaret had built together. A life that had begun with a chance meeting in a bakery, with a woman who thought herself too heavy to be loved, and a cowboy who had seen only perfection.